Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, it's the first episode in a new occasional strand that we're calling Now and Then with Robert Saunders, because every now and then we're going to be talking to Robert Saunders about an anniversary, something that happened this day, this month, this year, in the past, and what it means for the politics of the present and the future. Today, the anniversary connects to the history, the idea of unemployment. And we're going to be talking about the long history of thinking about people in work and people out of work, and the changing understanding of what work means. Robert, this conversation is inspired, provoked by an anniversary. And the anniversary is from the summer of 1955. So that's 70 years ago. This month and last month. That was the lowest recorded unemployment rate in the UK in peacetime. So in war, in the First World War and the Second World War, and we'll talk a bit about how these things are measured, there are a few months, if you look at the historic record, where unemployment more or less disappears. I think in October 1916, which is after conscription had come in, unemployment was recorded at being 0.4%, which is effectively zero. But in peace, the lowest ever recorded unemployment rate was 1%. And that was July, August, and I think September 1955. So 70 years ago, July was the lowest month in terms of the number of people registered. 215,800 people were registered as being unemployed in July 1955. At the beginning of Anthony Eden's prime ministership, he inherited, among other things, an astonishingly low rate of unemployment. And just for comparison, today, the rate is 4.7%. These things can be measured in so many different ways now, but it's about 1.7 million people, obviously in a much larger population. The high points in the history of recorded unemployment, and we're going to talk about when it became a way of talking about politics, a number, a figure, a statistic, which goes back to the 19th century. But the high points are, unsurprisingly, maybe in the 1930s. January 1933, 23% is, I think, the highest recorded rate in the UK. And that was about 3 million people in a much smaller population. Devastating levels of unemployment. Numerically, the highest figure of people recorded as being out of work, again, unsurprisingly maybe, is right in the middle of the Thatcher years, August 1985, 3.35 million people. So it's a number that fluctuates a lot. And in many ways, through the 20th century, it's one of the things we'll talk about into the 21st. Is it still true? It has defined politics, British politics, democratic politics, the rate of unemployment, how people think about unemployment, what it means. Is full employment a realistic thing? If it is a realistic thing, the summer of 1955 in peacetime is the closest we ever got to it. So these are the things we're going to talk about. And I think what's so interesting about this question is just, we almost take it for granted there's a thing called the unemployment rate, but how you think about it makes such a difference and has made such a difference to how British democracy has worked. So maybe we should start with the beginning of the story, which is the point in British political history when it became possible to measure or to talk about unemployment as a number. And maybe we should start even before that, because it's not like unemployment was invented when people were able to say, this is the number of people who are out of work. So if you go back, say, through the 19th century, this story begins in the late 19th century. But if you go back through the 19th century, how did people talk about unemployment in the absence of a number or a figure or a statistic? People presumably were aware there were booms and busts. There were periods where a lot of people were out of work, and to be out of work pre the welfare state was a desperate state to be in. Is it possible to say how people talked about, even conceptualize the category of unemployment before there was such a thing as the unemployment rate?
Well, as you've just shown, unemployment is an obsession of the 20th century, that we constantly measure it. We hear every month on the radio what the rate of unemployment is. An American president has just fired his chief of labor statistics because he doesn't like the unemployment figures that he's being provided with. And yet this is a word that does not exist until the 1880s. And I think as historians, our Antennae should always start to jangle when a new word emerges, because it does suggest that people are thinking about the world and imagining the world in new ways. Now, of course, they were very aware that people had not had jobs in the past, but the idea that there is a structural problem with the economy, which is not generating enough jobs for all the people who need them, that this is a collective problem, which might be the responsibility of government to tackle, that is a radically new idea. And it's part of a whole package of new terms that are emerging at the same time, like the economy, or the popularization of words like capitalism, which are all about this sense that we live in some kind of structure which constrains us as individuals, but that we might collectively be able to organize and manage. But that then kicks off 140 years of arguments, as you've suggested, about what unemployment actually is, how we measure it, who counts as being unemployed, and who's responsible for addressing it. So before that point, there's enormous concern about people who don't have jobs, especially in the early and mid-19th century. It's in the nature of an industrial revolution that it's creating colossal manufacturing towns, often dependent on a single industry, which means that when things go wrong, you get tens of thousands of people thrown out of work. And crucially, Victorian Britain was the most wage-dependent society anywhere on earth. This is not a peasant economy anymore, where people can scratch a living out of the land. People aren't living in the kind of family shack. They rely every week on their wages, and if they don't get them, they can't eat, they can't pay their rent. But when people talk about it, they tend, I think, to divide it into three kinds of phenomena or three kinds of explanations. So the first is that this is basically a population problem. The population of the UK roughly doubles over the 19th century. The population of somewhere like Manchester quadruples in the first half of the century. So one way of thinking about it is to say that just supply is outstripping demand. The supply of labour exceeds any possible stable demand for it. So the solution there is we try to encourage smaller family sizes, but much more, we encourage emigration. So 10 to 12 million people leave the UK over the 19th century, and that is partly a response to the unemployment problem. The second approach is to say, well, it's really a problem of mindset. And that might be about laziness, but it might also be about not being willing to move to where work actually is, or about not being willing to skill yourself, or not being realistic about the kind of wages that you can actually command. So the solution there is to educate people, if necessary, by disciplining them through things like withholding relief, unless they behave in certain ways. And then the third approach is to say that these are basically cyclical problems and that workers just need to get better at riding them out. So we've got to encourage things like friendly societies, saving, temperance, self-help schemes, so that when the bad times come, workers are better able to tide them over. Now, those are all ways of responding to the problem of joblessness, but none of them are about the government creating jobs or the government particularly intervening to try to build a level of employment. In fact, the fear is that the wrong kind of intervention might actually make things worse, because you will be discouraging people from moving or discouraging people from migrating or whatever it is that they need to do in order to solve the problem.
And even that word job, the history of the word job, I think it emerges in the early 19th century. We talk about work as jobs. But a lot of what you describe there, I don't think they would have used the language of job. They would have used the language of work, but crucially the language of wages. And it was very, very piecemeal and short term. There was an understanding. If a job entails some kind of stable relationship with an employer, there might be some of that. But in these rapidly expanding industries and towns, I think there was a general understanding it was extremely volatile. And I think most people understood, because it was a real boom and bust era as well, that it was cyclical. But presumably there was also a sense that there were thresholds beyond which it was socially and maybe even politically dangerous. Towns full of people without the means of subsistence, including lots of young men. Young men are frightening to politicians generally, and that was certainly true through the 20th century. Was there any sense before it was measurable, nonetheless, that there were kind of warning signs or signals or ways of thinking about this problem where you really want to avoid certain thresholds being crossed because you move from cyclical instability to something that feels a little bit more like anarchy?
Yes, so if we think about somebody like Karl Marx, who's writing about this in the 1840s and 1850s, one of the new phenomena that he's identifying is the rise of this class that has to sell its labour from one week to the next. It doesn't have a kind of living relationship with the land or with agriculture in the way that it did in the past. It's inherently deeply precarious. And of course, Marx thinks that you're not going to find a solution to this problem. It is simply going to destroy the existing state of society. This is an apocalyptic vision. And actually, Marx is not the only person who thinks that. Somebody like Sir Robert Peel, who is a Conservative Prime Minister in the 1830s and 40s, also basically thinks that this new industrial society that we're generating, in which millions of people are dependent from day to day on wholly precarious forms of industry, is not actually viable. He talks in terms of volcanoes exploding and earthquakes developing, and he looks at the French Revolution as a kind of first flickering of what industrial society is going to do. So one way to think about this is simply to say this is not sustainable, that either we have to have a revolution or we've got to recede, we've got to go back to a kind of pastoral society. If you're actually going to try and fix it, then you've got a different set of political problems. If you're going to try and survive this, then that's the question that governments are increasingly addressing over the 19th century.
And of course, we didn't have a revolution, and we didn't go back to being a agricultural, pastoral, pre-industrial society. So in some sense, by we here, I mean Britain, and we'll talk a little bit about international comparisons as well. We did fix it. And as you said just now, one of the ways of thinking about this, so there's a sort of moral disciplining at work, the idea that this is a mindset problem. But there were also clearly through the 19th century growing ideas about the ways in which certain kinds of protections could be afforded to the workers, and these could be achieved by the workers themselves, friendly societies, as you mentioned, forms of cooperation, also the beginnings of strikes and forms of labour confrontation. And out of that, you get the thing out of which comes measurable unemployment, and that is trade unions and the labour movement. Were trade unions originally conceived, this relationship between them and the idea of unemployment, were they originally conceived, do you think, as organisations to tackle joblessness, to ameliorate it, to deal with it, to confront this as a problem? Or were they closer to friendly societies, the idea that there are things that workers can do collectively to soften rather than to confront or tackle this issue?
I think when we talk about trade unions in the 19th century, we're talking about an enormous variety of different institutions, which frankly would conceive of themselves as having very different roles. But one reason why, if you like, revolutionary socialists in the 19th century are often quite skeptical of trade unions is because they do see them as essentially trying to manage the conditions in which they're living. They're also, and I think this is important, they're also a product of a period of society that doesn't instinctively look to government to solve problems, because it looks to government as a kind of enemy agency that sits over the top of society, that is controlled by the powerful. The idea that you might be able to use the state in constructive ways as a kind of instrument of the democratic will has to wait much later in the century for the expansion of the franchise. So this whole culture of trade unions, friendly societies, self-help clubs, insurance clubs, takes root in a society that broadly assumes that you have to address this yourself because nobody else is going to do it for you.
And you have to address it, not least because are we still in the middle of the 19th century talking about starvation conditions? I mean, how dangerous, never mind how dangerous for the established order, were these periods of brutal, rapid, cyclical unemployment. But was there a sense that this was a subsistence struggle, a life and death struggle? Friendly society makes it sound quite benign and gentle, but we're talking about people trying to find ways to live through months, maybe years, in which they have no means of feeding themselves and their children.
Yes, certainly in the 1840s, which gets labelled decades later the Hungry 40s, that's absolutely the case. And there's a sort of strange irony that the man we associate today with the birth of the welfare state, Clem Attlee, shares his first name with a word that's all over popular literature and fiction in the 1840s, which is clemming, which simply means starving. It's a working class word for total deprivation of food. And there are horrifying accounts in the 1840s, when there's harvest failure across much of Europe, of the poor digging up dead animals, diseased cattle that have been buried in search of food, doing extraordinary things to try to find food. And one of the things that operates a kind of counter-revolutionary pressure from the 1840s onwards is firstly harvest recovery across Europe, but then the golden age of free trade in which Britain starts vacuuming in food from across the world, which means that even when wages are very low and economic conditions are very poor, the nutritional standards of the British worker are actually higher than you'll find in almost any other society at the time.
And presumably before there were any means of measuring this, there were folk measurements of this. There were poorhouses and workhouses. There were people who had to throw themselves on the mercy of brutal institutions in order to survive. There were people on the road. Towns would be aware, towns and villages in the countryside would be aware, presumably through these cycles, of periods where there were many more people who were moving, looking for, not just for work, but for food, for the means of subsistence. Presumably, even in the absence of measurement, there was an awareness as people were going through these cycles of what they looked like and the signs, the signals that distress was growing. This is in the absence of government statistics, trade union statistics, but I almost feel like there's a sort of folk knowledge here that must have been at work.
Yes, and there is a certain amount of quasi-statistical data in that you can establish the number of people who are being supported by the poor law at any given time from the 1830s. There are all sorts of charities that can tell you how much they're spending each year. We get particular periods like the Lancashire cotton famine in the 1860s, where because of the American Civil War, large parts of the Lancashire textile industry are thrown out of work. You do know how many meals you're providing each day, how many blankets and how much shelter you're providing. So you've got some sense there. But there are a couple of flaws with that. So one of them is it's widely assumed that that underestimates the total, because the workhouse system is designed to stop people appealing to it. It is a deterrent system. So the whole point of it is that you're only getting the most desperate in the workhouse. There must be a much larger cohort of people out there who are intensely distressed, and that's the word that Victorians tend to use, but are not throwing themselves on the system. And if you're concerned, not just from a humanitarian point of view, but from, for example, a military point of view, is your population sufficiently well nourished so that it could actually fight a major war, then you're interested in the people who aren't coming to the workhouse system. The second thing it doesn't capture, and this is partly why the word unemployment starts to appear, is the phenomenon of underemployment. So take, for example, the coal miner whose pit is struggling and therefore he's put on short hours. He's perhaps only working 2 days a week. We wouldn't call that person unemployed. That person has a job. And yet we can say that there are perhaps 3 days of the week there in which there is no demand for that person's labour. So we can say that there is a certain quantity of unemployment there that isn't captured in the number of people who do not have a job.
So unemployment becomes a quality measured not by persons or individuals, but by the quantity of work. And therefore you have to then be thinking about an economy as a discrete unit that can be measured. And is it possible to say when and how the word emerges? Because my understanding of it is that the way in which this got measured did become more sophisticated and also regularized with the advent of trades unions that were keeping figures for their members about, so this is not the workhouse anymore, this is not a deterrent system, this is a support system of a kind into which people will have paid some dues as well, and keeping more reliable figures measuring when the union is being called on for support in a way that does come closer to capturing both the kind of in and out of being in work, but also the volume of employment or labour that was being demanded at a given period of time. Is that the relationship that creates an idea that we can call measurable unemployment?
Yeah, I think there's a statistical component, there's a democratic component, and there's a political component. So statistically speaking, the growth of trade unions does mean that they are starting to collect data on how many of their members are looking for work and how many of them are drawing on union insurance funds. Now, they're fairly rudimentary. No one thinks that this is capturing the workforce as a whole. But what it does do is it shows you the extremes of the peaks and troughs. If Trade union unemployment is 2% in 1887 and 9% in 1889, then there hasn't been a sudden surge of fecklessness in that time or personal irresponsibility. So that strengthens the idea there is something structural going on here.
Or indeed a sudden surge of breeding and overpopulation. It doesn't happen in 2 years.
Exactly, yes. So there's something structural going on here that we might be able to measure and to identify. Alongside that, democratization is changing how people think about the state in a way we've touched on already. It becomes increasingly possible to think of the state as a kind of instrument through which society tackles big collective problems. That's important. And then thirdly, parties are now competing for votes. Not generally from the unemployed themselves, because actually you lose your vote if you're on poor relief, but from the kind of people who are in danger of unemployment. And that means it's much more tempting to point at big social problems and say, this is the fault of the government. If we were in power, we could do things differently. So party competition actually picks up questions like unemployment and starts to carry them into the political arena.
And that happens before the dawn of the Labour Party. So the Liberal Party is willing to do this in the late 19th century, in the 1880s, the 1890s, which, as you say, it was a very volatile period. So if the 40s were the hungry 40s, the 1880s and 1890s were real boom and bust time, and the busts were bad, and times were hard, particularly in the 1890s. Does this precede Labour as we think of it as a party which does become identified, it's there in its name, with the question of work and the provision of work? Is it a pre-Labour phenomenon?
So it's rising up the political agenda in the 1890s. We see, for example, a parliamentary select committee on the want of employment. So we've got politicians drawing in evidence, bringing in witnesses, publishing reports, debating this in Parliament. So it's becoming a question that you talk about alongside more traditional parliamentary questions like the church or the empire or home rule for Ireland. But I think it is the Edwardian period when it really takes off. And that's partly, as you say, because from 1900 there is a party that has Labour in its name, the core identity of which is the right to work. And it introduces a right to work bill in Parliament. It doesn't go anywhere, of course, but it establishes the idea that it is a responsibility of government to provide good, dignified work to all human beings. But there's also alongside that a really important Tory dimension, and we've talked about it in an earlier episode, which is tariff reform. So after 1903, Joseph Chamberlain and a large chunk of the Tory party are saying that unemployment is happening because governments pursue free trade policies, because they refuse to protect British industry with tariffs. And they're running very dynamic colour posters with things like German workers stealing Britain's jobs. They're putting up pictures of unemployment queues with foreign employers laughing at them. There's even one of a skeleton stalking the land with a scythe marked unemployment. And nothing like that has ever happened before. This is a major political movement that is saying you are unemployed or your job is in danger because of the pig-headed policies of this government. And if you vote for us, we will change that. And that's really radically new. So we've got a pressure from the left, as it were, from the Labour Party, a pressure from the right, from Tory protectionists, and the Liberals, who are inherently the most laissez-faire party, have got to prove that they can also tackle unemployment without turning either to socialism or to tariffs.
Which is in a way what they do by introducing the first social legislation, because presumably at that point, so when in the first decade of the last century, the politics of this means that politicians of all stripes start to accept that dealing with this is a state responsibility. It's still a further step to say that the state's job is to measure this. Presumably in the very early 20th century, they were still relying on figures that were coming in from the outside. There were parliamentary commissions and so on, attempts to get legislation in Parliament. But the idea that the thing that becomes a feature of 20th century politics, which is the government every month, sees as part of its job to let its people know how many of them are out of work, that comes with the introduction of social insurance legislation, so that government, which is now itself invested in one of these schemes, is also going to be the measure of it.
The Liberals are starting to promote new ways of thinking about the state, and they're very drawn to organic models of the state, in which society as a whole is an organism which is mutually supporting and which has different kind of functions, all of which are to one another's benefit if they're in equilibrium. And increasingly, they talk about government as the brain of the state. So government is the mind that you can use to kind of discipline the body politic. So that means that government, first of all, can have a role in organising the employment system. So we get the introduction of labour exchanges, or what we're now called job centres, in 1909, which can bring together people who are looking for jobs and people who are looking for employees. And that's partly about cutting out the waste, where you have to stand outside the factory every morning to see if there's work for you, or you have to tramp around London, knocking on doors, seeing if anyone's in search of labour. So this is a state that's making the employment market work more efficiently. Then it's also promoting, I think, one of the first schemes in the world of national unemployment insurance. It's not providing it directly, that's still coming from trade unions and friendly societies, but it's subsidising it and it's mandating it. So it's helping to put it on a secure footing, it's helping to organise it, and it is accepting that the government actually has a financial responsibility to the support of the unemployed. So that sense of the intelligent state underpins a lot of what the Liberals do. But alongside that, they're also just starting to experiment with ideas of counter-cyclical budgetary policy. The idea that you might time government expenditure for the troughs in the economic cycle in order to balance out a loss of demand. It's very small scale before 1914. It's not on the kind of level that Keynes will be talking about later on, but it's a kind of seed from which we can see something growing later in our period.
In that seed, was there the glimmering of an idea of full employment, in the sense that it might be a goal of politics to maximize employment and to ensure effectively that more or less everyone who wanted work could find it? Or pre-1914, was that still utopian?
I think we'd struggle to find people who think that you're going to reach full employment, partly because there is still quite a strong streak that regards a section of the population as unemployable. And that's a term that's in very wide use in this period. It's the shirker, the loafer, the waster. So even what we might regard as quite progressive writing in the Edwardian period about the problem of unemployment still assumes that you're going to need things like labour camps for a section of the population who must be made to work, partly for their own benefit, but actually partly to stop them deteriorating and infecting the rest of the population.
And of course, we're talking about men here, so there's not much expectation that the employment regime will extend to women. And all of this is transformed within a couple of years. When I gave those statistics at the beginning, so no one's really thinking about the possibility of full employment in 1914. In 1916, by the government's own figures, only 0.4% of the working population, which by that point is going to include significant numbers of women, are out of work, because a total war economy in the pursuit of total victory does find jobs for everyone. It's an amazing transformation. It happens very, very quickly.
It does. But of course, that happens partly because you're taking millions of young men out of the economy in order to go and fight overseas.
And as I said, the figures drop dramatically after conscription. Conscription, which in itself is a novelty, to put it mildly, of early 20th century politics at the beginning of 1916, changes everything.
And conscription is both a military policy and an industrial policy. People are also being conscripted for certain kinds of employment. And it's not quite on the level of the 1940s, but that also feeds a sense that actually government, when it really wants to, can organise the economy more efficiently in a way that squeezes out unemployment and underemployment.
And that decade, the tens, the 1910s, it contains the birth of the British welfare state. It contains war, which then becomes total war, conscription, conscription to fight, conscription for work. And then at the end of the war, through to the early 1920s, an astonishingly volatile period. So when I was looking through the figures, by far the biggest swings you can find anywhere are from October 1920 to May 1921. So October 1920, and I think these figures are going to be pretty unreliable. The unemployment rate was 3.5%. In May 1921, so just over half a year later, it was 23.4%. And that boom and bust was on a scale that had never been seen before. So now we're in an era where the state has shown that if it puts its mind to it, maybe something like total employment is possible. And at the same time, as soon as it takes its eye off the ball and has other priorities, which it did after the end of the war, you can get whiplash unemployment.
The difficulty here, though, is that one of the priorities after the war is to normalise the economy. Almost nobody thinks that the way that the economy has been run at white heat during war itself is sustainable. There's a desire to go back to something that's regarded as a more normal pre-war economy. And because, as we've said, millions of men have been taken out of the workforce during the war, those millions of men are now coming back again. And part of the promise that was made to them during the war was that if they signed up, they would get their jobs back again. Now, in the meantime, lots of those jobs have been taken over by women. So it becomes a prime concern of government to push women out of the workplace again in order to release those jobs for men. And that does remind us of something that's, I think, always important when we're talking about unemployment, which is that it's never just about how many people are in work. It's about which people are in work. There is a real fear after 1918 of the returning servicemen. There's a debt of honour as well, but there's also a fear that these are people who have spent 4 years in the most hellish psychological conditions, who have been taught how to handle a gun, who have been taught how to fight, and they're all now flooding back to a country that very quickly is an industrial depression. So a prime concern of government is to keep those people happy. So the employment policy of the government after 1918 is partly an unemployment policy, which is about pushing women back out of the jobs they've been doing for the last 4 years.
And as I said, the figures dropped to almost nothing with conscription, with demobilization, which is what we're talking about here. They rocket up. And there's a parallel story that's happening somewhere else in Europe, in Germany. If they want a morality tale of what can go wrong under those conditions, millions of men returning, in this case, with the idea of defeat in their minds as well, that runs alongside the British story through the 1920s and crucially into the 1930s. At what point in the 20s do Keynesian ideas, including the possibility of full employment as an anchor of democratic politics, as a target, as an organizing principle, at what point do those ideas start to gain traction? Do they ever really gain traction before the Second World War? The intellectual building blocks are there in the interwar period, and unemployment, it's bad in the early 1920s. It's a lot worse in the early 1930s. And in the early 1930s, there is a fear it's not just cyclical. Something really has got entrenched. Does full employment become a way of organizing, thinking about democratic politics in that period?
Well, it's there as I would say, as a kind of minor key, but it's pushing against some very powerful headwinds. I think the interwar period is a really interesting and important part of our story here, because firstly, this is the first time that Britain has seen massive, sustained unemployment in absolutely core industries like mining, iron, steel, shipbuilding. It's the first time it's seen that since the 1840s. And secondly, this is now happening in a democratic society. Bluntly, the unemployed now have votes. And as you've suggested, you only have to look at Germany or Spain or Italy to see just how precarious democracy is in this period. Britain itself is running an experiment. It's enfranchised millions of people in 1918. It enfranchises millions more women in 1928. And really nobody knows whether this is going to work or not. We know that British democracy survives, but no one in 1931 or 1932 or 1933 knows that they're going to get through this. There is a bit of a sense among governments that they're all walking across a minefield carrying their democratic institutions. And one country after another, Germany, Spain, Italy, the Soviet Union, is stepping on a mine and going up in flames. And the British are putting one foot in front of the other and wondering at what moment they're going to detonate. So unemployment is an economic disaster in the interwar period, but actually it's also a very serious democratic danger. So one of the things that government is having to think about is not just how it fixes the economic system, but how its democracy survives this, how to some extent it insulates politics from the dangerous effects of unemployment.
Is there in politicians' minds, I mean, this is a slightly naive question because I'm pretty sure the answer is no, but almost instinctively an idea that there is a point beyond which it will not be sustainable? So, for instance, in the 1970s, when inflation rather than unemployment, though unemployment was serious, but it got a lot worse in the 80s, but in the 70s, inflation was thought to be the democracy destroyer. And it was Latin American countries that were held up as the model of, but for the grace of God, there we go. And there were numbers that were put on it, 20%, 25%. There's a threshold beyond which democracy cannot survive. That was the inflation argument of the 70s. Was there a similar idea that there were points beyond which this would not be survivable? So by the early 1930s, when roughly a quarter of the workforce are being counted by the government as unemployed, and we have to assume that all of these figures will undercount in some ways rather than others. Was there a genuine fear that maybe British democracy was a step or two, a percentage point or two away from going down the route that Germany was going down?
It's definitely a fear. We've still got, broadly speaking, a political class, certainly on the right in this period, that's classically educated, and therefore that has a sort of collective memory of democracy as a very precarious, short-lived system that only survives in small city-states, that hasn't really been tried on a large scale, apart from the United States of America, which has very unusual environmental conditions and still collapses into civil war in the 1860s. So everybody in the 1930s absolutely thinks that democracy might break down. The question is, how do you prevent that happening? So the Labour Party, once it's sorted itself out from the split of 1931, tends to take the view that the way to save democracy is to roll it forward, that you have to democratise the economy as well. You have to subject industry to democratic control. You have to introduce democratic national planning. And that is the only way that you can save democracy. The Conservative Party tends, I think, to be more pessimistic, actually. I don't think it's particularly that it's more cold-hearted. It's that it actually doesn't believe that it is in the power of government to bring unemployment down dramatically in what is a global economic crisis. So its priority, to a greater extent, is to try to insulate the political system from the effects of unemployment. And you do that partly through promoting macroeconomic stability. So you try to stabilize the currency, stabilize inflation, stabilize interest rates, which means actually for that portion of the population that is not unemployed, which is still the majority, of course, things are okay, that they're not actually feeling revolutionary. Secondly, you do embrace tariffs, you try to promote trade within the British Empire, and that's a kind of trade policy. But thirdly, actually, while you're waiting for the trade cycle to turn, you have to anaesthetize the unemployed by the payment of dole. So dole in Britain is not generous in the 1930s. There's a means test, which is actually really quite punitive for things like families with elderly relatives living with them. But it does mean there is some kind of national system which will stop the unemployed from starving. And Conservatives are fairly explicit that this is partly a humanitarian strategy, but it's also actually partly a democratic survival strategy.
Did the Labour Party think that a democratised economy could come close to recreating the conditions of full employment that the state had shown it was capable of in the First World War and crucially was going to show it was capable of in the Second World War as well? Had they started to move to the notion that a well-managed, democratically managed economic system couldn't just take the edges off the problem of unemployment and get beyond Tory subsistence support and actually come closer to giving everyone a job, acknowledging what was in the Labour Constitution, that the right to work was its raison d'etre?
Well, Labour tends to see unemployment in the 30s as proof of the absolute bankruptcy of capitalism. There are lots of books and articles written about the ethical horror and the moral horror of unemployment in the 1930s, that these aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet, that these are entire communities which are having the guts ripped out of them, and that these are coal miners, steel workers, shipbuilders, people who do important work for the nation who are being thrown on the scrap heap. And so when Ellen Wilkinson, the Labour MP, writes a book called The Town That Was Murdered about Jarrow, she means very explicitly that this town was murdered, that it was a deliberate decision by capital to destroy an entire shipbuilding area in order to maintain profits elsewhere. So I don't think they believe that you can sort of manage capitalism better, particularly at that point. But they argue that this is a system that will never be able to manage unemployment because the production of human waste is built into it. So it becomes an argument for moving to an entirely different economic system.
You said earlier that no one really during the First World War thought that this could be a model for a peacetime economy. This was clearly an emergency, and emergency measures were needed. It took the British state outside of the bounds of normal political economy. But in the Second World War, many people came to think that this was a model for a peacetime economy. And the Second World War, Britain was a country governed by a alliance of Labour and Conservative politicians who undertook a whole range of measures that would have been considered politically impossible before 1939. Very high levels of taxation, extremely interventionist policies in the labour market in relation to food supplies, prices, and so on. In a way, was that the crucial shift from the First World War to the Second World War, that the Second World War did seem to provide a model of a way in which an economy with considerable amounts of state intervention and state control could run at full capacity, which is what it did, after all. There's another question about the election of 45 and Labour winning and what happened after that, but just the sort of shift in mindset from 1918 to 1945. In 1945, this war did seem like an example of what had previously been thought to be impossible, but turned out to be completely achievable with political will.
I think a key difference between the two world wars is that the experience of the 1940s and the Second World War seems to vindicate a critique that's already politically very well established in the 1930s. Labour has been saying for a decade, and actually moderate conservatives like Harold Macmillan have been saying for a decade, that to some extent unemployment is a political choice, that this is happening because of the way that people in power are choosing to run the economy, and that the moment that the government actually needs its citizens in the 1940s, it can click its fingers and suddenly we have full employment. But more than that, it seems to achieve that by doing the things that Labour has spent 10 years saying it should do. It is now planning the economy. It hasn't nationalised, but it has effectively taken over the management of most of the commanding heights of industry. So the juxtaposition of mass unemployment under one system in the 1930s and full employment under what looks very like a Labour prescription for the economy, however misleading that analysis might be, in the 1940s is really significant. And so we get two documents produced during the war that have a very long afterlife in this debate, which is, of course, first the Beveridge Report in 1942, in which idleness is one of the five giants that must be slain. And then we get the 1944 White Paper on Employment, in which what is still a coalition government, so bringing together Labour and the Conservatives, commits itself to a high and stable level of employment and broadly accepts that demand management is one of the instruments that you can use to bring that about.
And in a way, what's so remarkable is that a high and stable level of employment is what is achieved. And it particularly beds in the 1950s. And there is a really interesting question about how how people do think about the 1950s. There are lots of different views of the 1950s. Many people still, I think, are quite nostalgic for the 1950s. It feels like a stable and secure time. And that does coincide with remarkably high levels of employment or low levels of unemployment. And yet, certainly by the time of the Thatcher years, 1950s Britain is thought of as sclerotic, stuck in its ways, very undynamic, an undynamic economy, an economy that's rapidly being left behind by the more dynamic economies, not necessarily the United States, West Germany, and European economies too. Japan is starting to be held up as a model, so corporatist rather than red in tooth and claw free market economies. But it is still extraordinary that that post-war consensus, it held through the 1950s, and it held around the question of full employment. That is as close as you can get to full employment, 1% unemployment, in an economy that also, less so at the time, because growth rates were quite high. I think in the early 1950s, it was a bit boom and busty. It was up and down, but the 1950s were not just flat. It was quite dynamic. But still, in historical memory, the 1950s were the thing that was going to have to be swept away first socially by the 1960s, and then economically and ultimately politically by the 70s and 80s. So in a way, my question for you, I don't know my own answer to this question, is how should we think about that anniversary that we're commemorating here this summer of 1955, the middle point of the decade. Anthony Eden has just become Prime Minister. Churchill has finally stood down. Churchill has presided over himself this period of historically low unemployment. Was that level of unemployment a reflection of an economy that was working, or an economy that was, in a way, almost frozen in some arrangement that came out of a previous decade and was going to have to be unpicked?
Well, that becomes a very politically charged argument, of course, in the 1970s and 80s. I think it's legitimate to question whether unemployment is really quite as low in the 1950s as it appears. A constant question in any debate on unemployment is what it actually is and how we measure it. And there is some evidence that much larger numbers of married women in the 1950s would have liked work than had it, and the official statistics tend to dramatically undercount the number of women who are unemployed.
And is it would have liked work and the work wasn't there, or would have liked work and for social and, frankly, sort of husbandly coercive reasons, they were not able to leave the home?
I think those two things are very hard to disentangle because this is, in a sense, the pinnacle of the male breadwinner model economy, that this is how the economy is supposed to work, that it broadly pushes large numbers of women out of the workforce and provides a higher wage to the men who are still in it. There's also, of course, lots of very unusual things happening in the 1950s. You've got a post-war rebuilding of the economy that's being driven by the United States across the world. You've got all of the kind of demands that's created by post-war reconstruction. Also, the war has temporarily reversed a process that was underway in the 1920s and 30s, which is the long story of deindustrialization. So there's a case of saying it kind of freezes deindustrialization for a certain period of time. But nonetheless, it's clearly an economy that is hungry for jobs, presided over by governments that are absolutely committed to maintaining a very high level of employment. But even at the time, there is a certain sense that the dark side might be sort of massing its forces beneath the surface. So Harold Macmillan in 1957 famously gives a speech in which he says, let's be honest, most of our people have never had it so good. But he then goes on to say the question is whether they can carry on having it that well in the future, because there's already an awareness that inflationary pressures are starting to build. It's already clear that Britain hasn't actually solved the problem of uncompetitive heavy industries that are going to be undercut by younger, more dynamic competitors elsewhere. There are growing questions about whether prioritising employment over every other economic indicator might actually be distorting the economy in ways that will build problems for the future. So all of those kinds of ideas that we'll see explode into the 1970s and 80s are beginning to be talked about in the politics of the 1950s themselves.
We'll talk more about this in the second part of this conversation, but there are other distinguishing characteristics of that economy. So it's a very low immigration economy, and that story is only just going to begin in that period. It is a time where very few people went to university. So it's before the big expansion of higher education. And indeed, most people left school at 16 and would expect to go into work. So there are categories of people who are not present here who can change the story about employment. Disability, which is something that we'll go on and talk about. Government does offer support for people who cannot work, but this is, again, a pretty narrow category. So we are talking about a workforce. Okay, I totally take the point that women may be excluded against their will, but we are still talking about a very large number of people who don't have further or higher education as a way of sort of moving in and out of the workforce, or maybe putting off the dread day where you have to get a job. We're not talking about high levels of immigration, but we are talking about people who expect to work when they leave school and expect to work from a pretty young age. It's also still a society in which the number of people who have ceased work and are now drawing a pension is relatively low relative to the number of people who are just coming fresh out of school and are expecting a job. So it's very different from 21st century British society. Leaving aside the question of the ways in which women were excluded, nonetheless, this is a lot of people who need to be found work, leaving school, presumably with few academic qualifications, but with an expectation that manual labour will be available for them. It's a very different economy from even what it would be in 3 decades' time.
Yes, and it's a more industrial economy on lots of measures than in the 1930s or perhaps at any point in British history. So it's a moment perhaps where an old economy still appears to be in rude health and a new economy is beginning to emerge. There is a big expansion in the amount of clerical work and white collar work in this period. And actually, you mentioned the school leaving age. It's worth remembering that one of the more radical things Labour does after 1945 is that Ellen Wilkinson, who wrote that book about the murder of Jarrow, at a moment when there is intense demand for labour in the economy, pushes for the school leaving age to go up, first to 15 and then to 16.
Thereby preventing employers from employing children, basically. We haven't even mentioned it, right? But we're talking about a period, we're talking about the 19th century through to the 20th century. Again, we tend to think of work as something that adults do, but at times where there was demand, children worked.
Yes, so one of the most famous books of the 1930s about unemployment is called Love on the Dole by Walter Greenwood, which then becomes a celebrated movie in the 1940s. And a key character in that is the son of the mining family, who I think is 18 and begins by mentioning that he's been in work for 5 years and he'd like a suit now.
So we're going to go on and talk about where this story goes, but I want to finish this part of the conversation with, in a way, the question that I began with, or a variant on that question I began with, which is the sense that politicians had through the 1950s into the 1960s, and then the key turning point in the 1970s, how much unemployment was tolerable. So we've described a story in which actually the pain threshold for the politicians, not for the people who are suffering, but the politicians, at various points has been pretty high. Conservative politicians in the 1930s. There is a fear that something terrible could happen, but nonetheless, a certain inevitability about high levels of unemployment that have to be borne. There's not much the state can do about it. But by the 50s, for whatever reasons, almost by accident as much as design, you have an economy in which there is work for people who want it, excluding all of those women who would like it and can't have it. And a growing understanding, I think, that this is something that politicians have got to try and continue to deliver. And as unemployment rises at various points, so up, not to 10%, 20%, but to 5%, 6%, the pressure starts to be felt through the 60s and then crucially into the 1970s when Edward Heath becomes Prime Minister. And there still seems to be a shared consensus that different figures are bandied around. But when 1 million people are on the dole, something very bad is about to happen. And you have to shy away from policies and economic strategies that might really exacerbate that. And in many ways, the key shift in British politics is the shift from that mindset to a radically different mindset, which happens through the 1970s and into the 1980s. Is it possible to say how it happened? How did it come about that post-war period, that period of post-war consensus, and then an unraveling of the consensus, a fraying of it, tensions around it, industrial unrest, rising inflation, the end of the age of deference, the whole of the 1960s. Nonetheless, you enter the 1970s, politicians still with a sense that they are bounded by something which cannot be borne, which is rampant unemployment. A decade later, unemployment is as rampant as it has been in the 20th century, and the government that allows that to happen doesn't just survive, it thrives and it prospers. It's one of the great shifts in political mindset. I'm going to ask you, how did it happen? What had to happen to make it possible for it to happen?
It's a really radical shift, and as you say, it's a really rapid one. In 1972, Ted Heath commits his famous U-turn, really reversing course on the central policy programme of his government because he thinks that you cannot survive an unemployment rate of 1 million. In 1979, the Conservative Party runs attack ads against Labour. Labour isn't working. People queuing for the dole outside because unemployment is reaching 1 million. And it's assumed that this is democratically dangerous. As in the 1930s, there is a real sense that democracies might break under this level of unemployment, but also that it's politically unsurvivable. And yet, as you say, the Conservative Party under Margaret Thatcher wins 2 landslide victories in the 1980s under astonishing levels of unemployment. Now, I think that's partly about electoral geography and first past the post. So the unemployment of the 1980s is national, but it's concentrated in its worst effects in certain industries and certain areas, the Conservative Party does lose those parts of the country, but it can still win handsome majorities without them. So there is a kind of psephological discovery that you can, in fact, build an electoral coalition that excludes the unemployed, even when the unemployed are a much larger cohort than normal. But it's also, I think, because the Thatcher government engages in, and to some extent wins, an argument about what unemployment is, what causes it, and whose responsibility it is to fix it. So, firstly, its outriders argue that the unemployment statistics are simply wrong, that they are overstating the level of unemployment. They're including far too many shirkers who shouldn't be considered as unemployed, too many young people, too many people who are just between jobs in the kind of natural churn that you would expect in a dynamic economy. There's always a question about how long do you need to be out of work before you become formally unemployed. And so one result of that is that over the 1980s, the government changes the definition of unemployment 30 times, and 24 of those make the number a bit lower. So they're trying, in a sense, to argue that this isn't all real unemployment. Secondly, and in some ways this is a contradictory argument, they argue that quite a lot of the unemployment of the 1980s is actually labour unemployment from the 1970s. So they argue that the economy of the 1970s is not generating as many jobs as it says on the spreadsheet. We have a large amount of what's called hidden unemployment. People who are in kind of fake jobs, there's overmanning in industry, there are restrictive practices, there are businesses that are being bailed out and subsidised by government, but these aren't real jobs and they're not tenable. And in that sense, they argue, what the Thatcher government is doing is simply shaking out this hidden unemployment, revealing the true situation, so that what's left can then become leaner and fitter and you can build better jobs for the future. And then thirdly, they try to shift some of the blame for unemployment back onto the unemployed. In the Tory press in particular, there's a lot more discussion of benefit cheats, scroungers, shirkers, people who won't do what Norman Tebbit says that his dad did, which is to get on their bike and go and look for work. So they're trying to recast the question of what's causing unemployment. And that allows them, in some ways, rather like in the 1930s, to say that there isn't a kind of magic bullet for unemployment. What we can do is restore macroeconomic stability, restore decent expectations in the workplace, break the damaging power of trade unions, and over time there will be a leaner, fitter economy that emerges in its place. And it's striking that if you look at opinion polling in the 1980s, the public overwhelmingly believes that Labour cares more about unemployment than the Conservatives. They don't really believe that Labour will actually bring unemployment down if it gets back into power. In that sense, they've lost faith in the idea that there is an alternative in a way that there appeared to be in the 1950s. And a great Thatcherite mantra is, Tina, there is no alternative. And in the unemployment debate, that seems to be strikingly successful.
One of the things I remember about Norman Tebbit, who died recently, is one of his lines in the 1980s is that every government department goes native and starts representing the groups that it was originally set up to manage. So the Foreign Office starts representing foreigners. And the line I remember is that the Employment Secretary becomes the spokesperson for the unemployed. And we have to reverse that. In the same way, we have to make sure that the Foreign Office actually represents Britons rather than foreigners. We have to make sure that those government departments that deal with unemployment don't see their job as representing, lobbying for the interests of the unemployed. Their job is to speak for the employed. That was it's a very Norman Tebbit way to put it, but it was a really radical shift. And in a way, as you say, it is back to an earlier age, which is, as you've also said, it's electorally sustainable in an economy where the unemployed are always a minority. If the unemployed are a majority, democracy will collapse. So you are talking about a minority. If you can build an electoral coalition out of the people who are doing well and gear government towards their interests, you have something that is, maybe sustainable is the wrong word, but at least politically has really got legs.
And I think that discovery, and it really is a discovery, that you can win elections with very high levels of unemployment, is in some respects quite liberating for some ministers. There's a myth that the Conservative government comes to power with the deliberate purpose of increasing unemployment in order to break the trade union movement. There's really no evidence of that at all. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence of something approaching panic in government internal communications in the early 1980s at what is happening to the unemployment figures. Friedrich Hayek, who is in some ways their economic guru, says the government won't be able to survive this. It can survive it for 6 months. It can't survive it until the next general election. When they discover that they can survive it, it becomes easier to think about what the benefits might actually be of a more fluid employment market, that this does have a disciplining effect on trade unions. It does change expectations about things like wages and employment conditions. It introduces more competition into what is increasingly being referred to as the jobs market. So I think it's John Major's first chancellor, Norman Lamont, who in 1991 says unemployment is a price well worth paying to bring down inflation. Now, that might be an argument that some ministers would intellectually have defended in earlier decades. None of them would have said that publicly. And it's something that George Osborne repudiates 23 years later. But it's a mark of an intellectual revolution that seems to have happened in British politics, that you've broken the idea that unemployment must be the first priority of every government, whatever other economic indicator goes haywire as a result.
As I mentioned there, this is a conversation in 2 parts, and if you enjoyed that, available for you now is part 2 on PPF Plus, in which we take the story up to the present, from the Thatcher years to 2025, and think about the changing character of work in that time. Robert and I talk about, among other things, the impact of the COVID pandemic on the changing understanding of what it means to have a job in the first place. We talk about the intersection between the politics of employment and the politics of immigration. And we ask whether work still has the dignity that is traditionally associated with it. If you would like to hear that episode, all you have to do is sign up to PPF Plus. Click on the link in the show description. Go to our website, ppfideas.com. You will get that episode, you will get all of our future bonus episodes, and you will get straight away all of our past bonus episodes from the last 18 months, plus ad-free listening. Next time, in our regular slot, it's back to politics on trial and to the story of one man and 3 trials, the trials that destroyed him. It's the trials of Oscar Wilde. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.